Harris, who is also. And we also have Alicia Scholl, who is from the McMenamins History Department. In the back, we have a wonderful crew of McMenamins folks here ready to serve you and take your tips. So please put them to work. We're happy to have them here.
Can we get the podium a little louder, please? I'm sorry.
Okay, we're still working out the technology, y'all. So now I'm gonna go back on script. Okay, so welcome to Race Talks Movie and Conversations. Tonight's program is Who Gets to Be American? The connection between our current immigration crisis and World War II American concentration camps. Join Race Talks as we explore the correlations between the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II and present-day refugee policies and protests through the screening of Oregon Public Broadcast, Oregon Experience, Japanese Oregon Americans Beyond the Wire. For our folks who may be watching on Facebook, we unfortunately don't have the licensing rights for the music, and Facebook will shut us down. So we're going to go dark while we play the movie, but we will leave a link where you can access it on YouTube. So if anybody here with us presently or in Zoom land knows someone watching on Facebook, our Zoom access is still open on our website, Race Talks PDX. So if you want to register and come into the Zoom space with us, you can watch it from in there as well. But we will go dark for the next 65 minutes, and then we'll have our public conversation back online over Facebook, yes. I get FaceTime and Facebook confused. We also have a couple of announcements to share before we start. So in case you leave early, we gotta do a little housekeeping. So if we go to slide number 9, please become a Race Talk subscriber to stay connected and receive updates about our programming. And maybe not slide number. There we go. Slide number 11. Okay, and then you can visit Race Talks to see our quarterly programming and to register for all events. You can also make a donation at our website. And thank you to our sponsor, McMenamins and Third Eye Books, Brett Brown Photography, and Teresa Horney Web Design. And to become a Race Talks sponsor, you can contact us at info@racetalkspdx.com. And if you're interested in being a Race Talks volunteer, some of you were gracious enough to help us with setup, but we also need community ambassadors to hand out some of our flyers and get the word out that we're doing this live. If you came back here during pre-pandemic times, this room was completely filled to the brim. There was barely any walking space. It was bustling, it was loud, it was chaotic, it was amazing. And we want to get back to that. So please take all the brochures on your table, pass them around to people. We're here every second Tuesday of the month. We also have some virtual programming and some special programming that we do here at McMenamins that's not on the second Tuesday. Our Third Eye Book sponsor also has a 25% discount for recommended book readings. And our recommended reading for tonight is Made in Japan and Settled in Oregon by Mitzi Asai Loftus, who is one of our special guests tonight. And so, oh, thank you, Caitlin. This is the events we have coming up over the next 4 events that we have scheduled. So if you notice at the bottom, it'll let you know if it's happening here at the community school gym, or if it's a hybrid Zoom event, or where the location is. So we hope that you will participate. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our special guests.
Thank you very much. My name's Toby Asai Loftus. Can everybody hear me okay? Give me a little wave.
We're working on the technology here. We look
Okay.
a little different.
Sorry.
That's all right.
I have a nice welcome for you, Toby. Toby and I had a fantastic conversation the other day. I think we talked for almost 2 hours, just getting to know each other and talking about this topic. So it is a really amazing thing. So this is Toby and his mother, Mitzi. So we are in favor of the mother and child dynamic. Donna Maxey is my mother, and she's also the founder of Race Talks. So Mitzi Asai Loftus was born in Hood River, Oregon. As a girl, she was incarcerated along with her family in Japanese American concentration camps, Tule Lake, California, and Heart Mountain, Wyoming. She graduated from the University of Oregon and taught for 47 years, including teaching English in Japan on a Fulbright scholarship. She is the author of Made in Japan and Settled in Oregon, and she lives in Ashland, Oregon, and she's joining us virtually. And we're also joined with her son, Toby Asai Loftus, who is the youngest of Mitzi's three sons. So Chip, who was in Mitzi's husband's class, knew the first two sons, and we were trying to debate if Toby was the third, so we have it confirmed. Toby graduated from Brown University and works in IT. He has performed on the viola in the Newport Symphony for over 16 years. He loves to travel and writes for several blogs. He is a karaoke aficionado and has hosted over 40 online karaoke parties during the pandemic. Toby, we do karaoke and conversation, so consider this your official invite to come host. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Toby and Mitzi. And Toby is going to lay out a bit of the movie and some perspective before we start the movie, and then we'll come back after the movie and Toby will kick off the Q&A. And of course, Mitzi, as the elder, you get to say whatever you want when you want. So you just jump on in whenever.
Mom, do you want to say anything first?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, I'm calling in from Coos Bay, Oregon. I took this picture just this weekend. This is where I grew up. I'm grateful and honored to be able to share this virtual stage with my mother, Mitzi Asai Loftus, to discuss this dark chapter in American history and her family's experience. My grandfather arrived in the United States in 1904 and my grandmother in 1911. They lived in Hood River, raised 8 children, were married for over 50 years, and lived through the darkest period in American history for Japanese Americans. Of those 8 children, only my mother and her sister Mika are still alive. The documentary that Oregon Public Broadcasting made that you're about to see is excellent. It does a really good job describing the events leading up to the war, the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, and the post-war racism and persecution. You will see my mom's family represented throughout the movie. The very first image in the movie is of my grandfather and grandmother and my 2 oldest uncles. You will see video clips of my Aunt Bessie, my mom's sister-in-law. She speaks throughout the film. She turned 99 in March, so she's still with us. During the film, I invite you to do 3 things. 1, watch and listen for anti-immigration rhetoric, fears, and the laws that were used against Japanese Americans. And think about, do any sound similar to those that are used today against immigrant groups today? Secondly, listen for euphemisms that are used to describe this period in history. Assembly centers, relocation centers, evacuation, and internment. Ask yourself what terms might be more accurate and more descriptive than those. And finally, I ask you to consider, what would you do if people that you knew were being targeted and treated like Japanese Americans were during this time? I know you're going to enjoy the movie. It's excellent. And after the film, I will share more specifics about my mom's family, their experience, and then hopefully that will kick off some good discussion. That's everything I have to say. If you're ready to roll the film, everybody, I know you're going to enjoy it.
Toby, I'm going to ask you to repeat 1, 2, and 3 one more time for some of us slow writers.
Sure thing. I will. So as you watch the film, I invite you to do 3 things. The first is watch and listen for anti-immigrant rhetoric, fears, and the laws that were used against Japanese Americans. Ask yourself if any of these sound familiar to those that are used today against immigrant groups. Secondly, Listen for euphemisms that are used to describe this period. For example, assembly centers, relocation centers, evacuation, internment, and so on. What terms might be more accurate and more descriptive? Thirdly, consider what would you do if people you knew were being targeted and treated today like Japanese Americans were treated back then. And if you want, I can try and type those into the chat.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, everyone. I have to turn the live off really quick.
Oregon Experience is a production of OPB in partnership with the Oregon Historical Society. Leading support for Oregon Experience is provided by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer, and the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Charitable Trust Fund for Lifelong Learning. Major support provided by the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by the Stephen D. and Marilyn C. Kerman Charitable Fund, Kay Kitagawa and Andy Johnson-Laird, John and Nancy Decherd, Russell and Sylvia Yamada, and the contributing members of OPB and viewers like you. Thank you.
They were invested in America. This was their country, the land of opportunity.
But then came war.
People now just cannot imagine how much hatred there was directed at the people of Japanese ancestry.
It was mass guilt based on race.
It was a time of civil rights denied.
We were in Block 32, Barrack 9, and Room C.
All I remember was soldiers with guns.
And lives to rebuild.
They gave us a train ticket home and $25, and that was it.
I remember this older gentleman in our car crying as he saw the Columbia River, the sign of freedom.
I think the Japanese-American story is, in a way, a real success story.
We always forgive. You can't forget, but you can always forgive.
Every spring on the Portland waterfront, 100 akebono cherry trees blossom on cue.
My view is to honor the immigrants that came and started businesses and started their life here. The Japanese American community is an important part of the community here in Oregon.
Dedicated to the Bill of Rights, the Japanese American Historical Plaza tells a story.
Well, they may notice one little thing written on a stone, and they'll take that home. They take that home with them. They'll look around. That was the whole idea, is you hear the voices, and it makes you look around, you see.
They are talking stones, giving voice to the past.
Just over there was our old community. Echoes, echoes, echoes.
Old Town today was Japantown yesterday.
We called it Nihonmachi during the 30s, right up to World War II. Restaurants and hotels and fish markets and bathhouses, doctors, dentists, schools. And you'd hear conversation in Japanese as well as in English. It was a very vibrant, friendly community, and that's where I grew up.
In about a 10-block area, more than 100 businesses thrived.
Teikoku, that was my home. It was in the Merchant Hotel, and we lived on the 4th floor, and downstairs was the store. It was started by my grandfather, and my father, I think, took it over in 1924 with his brother-in-law. They sold mostly dry goods, and they would also sell dress-up clothes like arrow shirts and Florsheim shoes and Stetson hats.
By the late 1890s, hundreds of Japanese immigrants, mostly bachelors, had begun arriving in the Northwest. Portland was a hub for finding services, supplies, and jobs. They went to work in canneries, built railroads, and farmed.
Many Issei, the first generation, viewed an opportunity to become what they called birds of passage. They anticipated coming to America to work hard for 3 to 5 years, and then return to their homeland where they would live good lives. That, of course, didn't happen because they ended up staying much longer, marrying, raising children who were American citizens, and they determined that they were in America to stay.
My father happened to work on the railroad, and he kept saving his money eventually to buy into a small boarding house hotel in Japantown. He was quite an entrepreneur, and he started a fruit and vegetable stand out on Columbia Boulevard. He ended up having a second one. My mother tended to the hotel pretty well all day long, while my father tended to the markets.
As families took root, Nihonmachi grew, and a second Japanese community formed along Portland's southwest waterfront.
Oh, I was born in a hotel. My parents ran the hotel, and I helped them run it. Because I had chores to do every Saturday, help vacuum the hallways, polish the brass.
We banded together with people that spoke the same language, ate the same food, had the same culture, and that's what really created Japantown.
They had that sense of togetherness for survival, because there were all these laws against us, that we couldn't do this and couldn't do that.
For the first half of the 20th century, the United States Constitution barred Japanese immigrants, Issei, from becoming U.S. citizens. Their hopes for the future rested with the Nisei, their American-born children.
The Issei saw what America was like, and they saw that, boy, education is a key if you want to make it.
The children attended a variety of neighborhood schools, including one started by nuns from Marylhurst College.
They found a little storefront and started St. Paul Miki. St. Paul Miki was a Japanese saint. It was not popular to be teaching Japanese children at that time, but they came.
In order for the parents to communicate better with the children, they figured, gotta have a Japanese school. So when we were growing up, not only did we go to regular elementary school, but we also went to Japanese school.
Japanese American families were also scattering to more rural farming areas in the valley. Sisters Aya and Taka grew up in Hillsboro.
My mother got us up and she says, "We got to cut the asparagus before you go to school."
Early pioneers near Salem included Reed Saito's grandparents.
Actually, it was all Japanese farmers right there in the Labiche area. There was 7 Japanese farmers that farmed along the lake bottom. Celery was their main crop. Around 1940, they moved up to the Gresham area, where they truck farmed.
By the 1920s, there were about 4,100 Nikkei, all people of Japanese ancestry living in Oregon. The second largest population outside Portland lived in the Hood River Valley, where orchards were created from forests. Caucasian landowners like the Babsons in Parkdale hired Japanese crews to help clear the land.
And some of them offered incentives. They told them, if you'll work for us, if you'll clear 15 acres of land for me, I'll give you 5 acres. And that land might be stump land or brush land or marshland, but it was land just the same. So many Issei, like my grandfather, decided that was what they would do. And Grandpa worked 7 days a week.
I was born at D, Oregon. Yeah, it was a pretty small community, but you know, those early days, they still had a lumber mill going. Dad worked at the lumber mill. He had an orchard too, but anything we could do, we had to do it.
My name is Bessie Asai, and I was born in Hood River. When my father got here, he bought a piece of land that had nothing but trees on it, and he had to chop them all down and get ready to farm. He wanted pears and apples. The trees weren't producing anything yet, so he had to get some way of making a living, so he planted strawberries in between the young trees.
What was unique about the Issei was that the men didn't just farm by themselves. Farming became a family project.
My father pruned the trees, and my mother and I had to pick up the brush. We learned how to drive a tractor before we could drive a car.
Masuo Yasui would become one of the most successful businessmen in the valley. Arriving in the Northwest in 1903, he first found work on the railroads, then as a houseboy in Portland, where he perfected his English.
So he got on the train to go east and was passing through the Hood River Valley. And he saw Mount Hood, and it reminded him of Fujiyama because it is a beautiful, symmetrical mountain. So he got off the train and stayed for many years after that.
Yasui, backed by his older brother, opened a small store catering to the Japanese community. The store grew and prospered.
It became a hub of activities. It was a mail drop. It was a place where the Issei men, mostly, in 1908, could come and get information, and my father ran an employment agency.
And also, he would accompany people to Portland when they had to get licenses or any kind of papers, because he was completely fluent in English as well as Japanese, of course.
Yasui married, and with his wife Shizuyo raised a large family, including future attorney Minoru Yasui, the first Japanese American admitted to the Oregon bar. And all along the way, Masuo and his brother acquired land.
Before World War II, they had in the aggregates, not one parcel, between 600 to 800 acres of land. That's a lot.
He was a real booster for the United States. He says, America is where you're living. You know, once you put your roots down here, this is where you have the opportunities to have a good life.
There were grave concerns about the success and the work ethic of Japanese farmers. Their children were growing up and attending American schools. They were becoming productive, and they were becoming an economic threat.
By 1919, the Hood River Anti-Asiatic Association had formed with a simple goal.
They wanted to keep the Japs from taking over the land.
To prevent further acquisitions, the Oregon State Legislature passed the 1923 Alien Land Law, prohibiting Issei from owning or leasing land.
More than 80% of the Issei property, however, was actually in the names of their children who were American citizens.
Politicians, neighbors, communities, they called us the Yellow Peril. They called us the Fifth Column. They had many names for the Japanese.
By the late 1930s, events in the Far East were further fueling anti-Japanese attitudes at home. President Franklin Roosevelt had ordered government agencies to monitor certain individuals of Japanese descent.
The FBI had a list of 1,370 Japanese up and down the West Coast on their so-called dangerous spy list.
Those on the list would be picked up first in case of war with Japan.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The FBI swooped in early, taking our elders in the process for subversive that and this.
Their main goal was to arrest the leaders of the community, therefore they could stabilize the rest of the people, and they would follow the orders of the government, whatever they did.
My father was, without any question, a very prominent Japanese in the valley. The store was immediately shut down after Pearl Harbor. We couldn't even sell bread.
Issei and Nisei assets were frozen, so they couldn't draw money from banks. They had neighbors and friends who would not speak to them. Many of the Nisei had never been to Japan, but they looked like the enemy, and that was the difference.
The United States government issued a list of contraband items that people of Japanese ancestry could not possess, like shortwave radios, rifles, shotguns, bullets.
I think the sheriff came to the house and found one stick of dynamite in the barn. And so they arrested my father. But, they used dynamite to blow up the trees, So it was part of living. But they took him anyway.
My father and my uncle both got arrested on December the 11th. I was in school, and when I came home, my mother and aunt, they were crying. They didn't know where he was at or anything. He ended up at Rocky Butte Jail for about 2 weeks. They took his belt, and they took his shoestrings and necktie. They didn't give him a fork. They put the food outside the cell, so he had to reach out and eat it. He said that they think we were a bunch of dogs or rats.
Issei, considered potentially dangerous, like the Matsushimas and Yasuis, were sent to special internment camps run by the Department of Justice. No crimes had been committed, no charges were filed, and no legal representation was allowed. But while there, individuals received a hearing.
They pulled out a very childish drawing of the Panama Canal, and they held it up and said, look, he was going to bomb the Panama Canal. Why did you have this drawing in your house? And Matsu says, I think that's one of my children's drawings. It was devastating to be a person of that stature and then to be taken away, accused of being a spy and a traitor, and he never returned to Hood River.
They were considered POWs, enemy aliens.
A Shinto minister, my language teacher, my dentist, my Dr. Tanaka, the editor to our newspaper, Mr. Oyama, the owner of the fish market, floral shop. They were law-abiding citizens, fine people.
Back in Oregon, remnants of the Japanese community were rallying against growing racial hatred. In Portland, many gathered to publicly declare their allegiance in a telegram to President Roosevelt. And in Hood River, more than 100 signed a letter to Governor Charles Sprague.
May we pledge our loyalty to the Stars and Stripes, just as do our children, who are patriotic American citizens.
My mother signed it, and my uncle signed it, and my father couldn't because he was already in prison in Missoula. It was a scary time, but more than that, it was a very bewildering time because we didn't know what was going to happen next.
On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order broadly authorized the War Department to designate strategic military areas, from which any and all persons could be excluded. By early March, Army General John DeWitt, head of the Western Defense Command, had created these specific zones and declared that any person with 1/16 Japanese blood would be subject to removal. A Jap is a Jap, he would say. There is no way to determine their loyalty.
Politicians were responsive to the community members who were beginning to say they didn't want Japanese in their midst because what about all these sabotage stories that we've heard? So the media, the politicians, even Oregon Governor Charles Sprague, who initially had been cautious about how we treated Japanese, eventually then supported internment.
On March 24th, DeWitt declared a nighttime curfew for all German and Italian aliens and all persons of Japanese ancestry. 26-year-old Minoru Yasui, now an attorney, had been working at the Japanese consulate in Chicago. But when war broke out, he'd returned to Portland, and he decided to challenge the curfew as unconstitutional for American-born citizens.
So Min says he walked up and down Burnside for two hours or something to get tired. And finally he ran into a cop and he says, "Officer, you have to arrest me because persons of Japanese ancestry must not be out of their place of residence after 8 o'clock at night. It's 11 o'clock now." And the cop says, "Go along, Sonny, you're going to get in trouble. Run off, get on it." So Min said, "Well, that didn't work out so well."
He wanted to get into trouble, and so he marched over to what then was the police headquarters and argued with the desk sergeant there and, convinced him to arrest him.
He knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he believed that the courts would vindicate his rights. And it was interesting because the judge said that this curfew violation is unconstitutional as to U.S. citizens. But because Yasui had worked for the Japanese consulate, he'd abdicated his citizenship. So he became an enemy alien and was found guilty.
Yasui would spend 9 months in solitary confinement while his case was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The court reinstated his citizenship, but upheld the curfew violation as a military necessity.
He didn't get bitter. He didn't give up. He didn't stop believing in the Constitution. So, that's amazing.
By the end of March 1942, Exclusion Order Number 1 had been posted on Bainbridge Island, Washington. More than 100 such orders would be issued up and down the West Coast. Nearly 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, prepared to leave their homes for temporary detention facilities, euphemistically called assembly centers.
What school children had to do was we had to take a slip of paper around, have our teachers sign it, that we're dropping out. One of my teachers stepped out into the hallway with me and told me how bad she felt, that we had to be incarcerated, go into the assembly center. She was my English teacher. Mrs. Town was her name.
FBI came and padlocked the store. They said no more business. And then they reopened it, and they told us to sell everything. Whatever they would offer, you would take.
Some Japanese Americans found trusted friends or neighbors to sublease their business, store possessions, or caretake their orchards.
There were others, though, who felt they needed to sell their property quickly for very cheap prices.
Those of us in Japantown, we could not leave our possessions with our neighbors. Our neighbors are Japanese. They are going to leave with us. And so we lost everything.
It was just really a flurry of activities, and we had to put our initials in white paint on the ends of the suitcase. My mother sewed a big duffel bag, and she stuffed it with sheets and towels. But it was only what we could carry. That's right. It's only what we can carry.
Some of the stories we hear about, some of the older men wearing 2 or 3 overcoats, or 2 or 3 suit jackets, and whatever. But it was kind of a desolate feeling, I think.
Family names became numbers.
And that family number, 15066, we had to put onto our jackets, we had to put onto our bags that we were going to carry, we had to put onto everything. And those of us that were incarcerated, we'll never ever forget our own family number.
On the morning of May 13th, 1942, Hood River Nikkei gathered at the train station.
There were armed guards. There were bystanders. And the local newspaper even publicized an article talking about the celebratory atmosphere. But in fact, my grandparents and their friends remembered crying in the train as it left.
The quick brushing of hands across eyes. Women sat with bowed heads while their menfolk stared straight ahead. Hood River News.
All the blinds were down and we didn't know where we were going. We don't know how long we were going to be gone or anything. Not knowing where we were going was terrible.
Those from Hood River were on their way to Pinedale, California, near Fresno.
Hi, Bessie. I'm sending the valley to you. Hope it makes you feel good.
Nikkei from the Willamette Valley reported to Portland's Assembly Center, a livestock exhibition pavilion hastily converted to house more than 3,500 incoming citizens.
My first impression, I can smell the odor of the manure seeping through the wooden floors. I remember the smell of livestock urine permeating throughout the building.
When we got there, we were assigned 3 stalls, and they were like regular horse stalls, you know.
Our living cubicles had no ceilings and no doors, just a canvas drop cloth. The sounds of the night were quite loud and easy to hear.
It was a barbed wire barn.
The newly created War Relocation Authority, the WRA, was in charge, and official government photos were carefully controlled.
We were on display, so to speak.
For those detained, the summer of '42 would be a waiting game, as construction continued on 10 more permanent camps.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt called them concentration camps. He referred to us as inmates.
I asked Minnie Issei, did you think about saying no? There were no charges, and my children are American citizens.
We thought that if this is what the government, declared, we needed to do it.
Japanese have a saying, shikata ga nai, I mean, it can't be helped, so what can you do about it?
And if you can't control it, shikata ga nai.
Meanwhile, outside the exclusion zone, a crisis was growing in eastern Oregon, and the root cause was sugar.
Sugar could be used in the manufacture of synthetic tires and other parts of this bomber. And sugar's most important byproduct, molasses, went into the production of the industrial alcohol used in the manufacture of these bombs.
There's a component in a sugar beet that was used to produce ammunition, to make bullets. So the federal government directed local area farmers to increase their sugar beet production by 75%.
By early 1942, the Amalgamated Sugar Company in Nissa had 12,000 acres of sugar beets growing in Malheur County. But the war had swept young men into service, leaving too few people to tend and harvest the crops. George Aiken, secretary to Oregon Governor Charles Sprague, offered a solution: relocate the state's 4,000 Nikkei to former Civilian Conservation Corps camps in 3 counties, where they'd work on public works projects and provide critical farm labor. The WRA rejected the plan, fearing anti-Japanese violence in the communities. But desperate for labor, Oregon farmers and Amalgamated Sugar began pressing Governor Sprague for action.
They went back to the federal government with the Little Oregon Plan, which proposed allowing to build 1 camp in Malheur County.
The proposal guaranteed that state and local officials would keep peace in the community, and employers would pay the prevailing wage. This plan was a go.
So the very first place that a Japanese American could go, other than a concentration camp, was this test camp in Nissa, Oregon, something we're extremely proud of.
Recruitment at the Portland Assembly Center began immediately. Young bachelors were the first to volunteer.
My dad, Kano, he helped set the tent camps up. His friends and the people in the assembly center told him, you better not go because you're probably going to get shot. I think the reason was at that time, Governor Clark of Idaho was really anti-Japanese.
But Nisei began working the fields and sending positive feedback.
It said, the farmers here around the Nissa area, Jameson, Vale, Ontario, were good people, and they thought it would be okay.
My oldest brother went out on the second group, and he says, even though we would have to live in tents, we would be much more freer to live a family life. So as a result, we decided to volunteer to go to Eastern Oregon too.
Each morning, local farmers would pull into camp and pick up their crews.
We had to throw the sugar beets on the truck, and sometimes you hit the other person on the other side. And this is Kano with a big sugar beet.
That's how big the sugar beets were. Can you imagine?
Nikkei families already living in the area welcomed the newcomers. There were weekend dances and trips to town.
Local farmers could see what kind of people they were.
Sonny Takami was one of them.
My dad was 6'1", I think. Always smiling, laughing. He was a security officer for the camp and made sure everybody made their curfew.
They didn't cause problems. They went about their work. And I think because of that, the Nisei that were here kind of covered up the cultural divide.
This is a picture of our father.
That fall, the camp moved to a former CCC camp nearby.
This is in Adrian, where the barracks were.
The Nissa experiment had proven so successful that farm labor camps were started in other western states. Ontario itself would never be the same.
People that came here to work, a lot of them established
farms of their own and started a life here. Treasure Valley has been really good to the Japanese people, and they've been good for them.
We helped each other. We decided to lift ourselves up and make the best of it, and that's what we did.
My dad helped start a church in Ontario. There's a big calligraphy of God is love. My dad did that.
And down the road, at the Four Rivers Cultural Center, a Japanese garden thrives.
They were able to build these communities like ours with tolerance and mutual support between different races. I mean, this is a very remote area, and the idea that there's an infusion of another ethnic group just changes this community's world.
Black smoke rolls across the blue sky. Winter chills our bones. This is Minidoka.
By early fall 1942, Japanese Americans who'd been living at the temporary assembly centers were preparing to move again, this time to the 10 incarceration camps now considered by the government fit for occupancy. The camps shared common attributes: uninsulated barracks built on large tracts of federally owned, isolated land.
When the government was thinking about doing this before it was ever announced to the public, they'd actually picked over 300 locations in the country to place camps and then narrowed it down to the 10. Tule Lake just happens to be one of them.
Tule Lake in Northern California, or Wyoming's Heart Mountain, would be the destination of most Japanese Americans from Hood River. Most from the Portland area boarded a train to Minidoka, near Twin Falls, Idaho.
You see nothing but sagebrush, gray, green, blue-green, whatever, but sagebrush.
We went to Minidoka in September. It was dusty and hot, and the winter was so bitterly cold.
I remember that winter of 1942, it got to be 22 below zero. We were literally freezing. I remember my sister Mary and I bundling up with every piece of extra clothing we had, waiting for morning to finally arrive.
We had a pot-belly stove, and my job was to get the coal and feed the stove.
About 5 families to a barrack, I think. And we had just one room with 4 beds. Because we had a community bathroom. No privacy. So everybody tried to go after midnight.
We lined up to take a shower. We lined up to do our laundry. We lined up to eat. I remember lining up once a week to get our 2 rolls of toilet paper. We just lined up for everything.
We are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation.
When you watch the War Relocation Authority videos that came out during that time period, our country gives the impression that we're doing this for the good of the Japanese and Japanese Americans, that we're protecting them.
They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity.
But yet, when folks actually got to camp, they realized that the barbed wire is pointed in on the tops, preventing them from getting out, not somebody from getting in to harm them. And so they quickly start to realize how isolated they are because of that.
We're American citizens. We have equal rights. We were stripped of all of our rights. I quickly learned and actually admired the resourcefulness of the Japanese people. They organized. They elected a block manager. Those people that cooked on the outside started to work in the mess hall.
We waited on tables and cleared the table, and they paid us the $9 a month.
I worked for the Minidoka newspaper, and I was the delivery person.
People that were doctors tried to start a hospital. People that were dentists looked after our teeth. People that were teachers tried to start schools.
When the school bell rings, get the signal for these students at Hart Mountain in Wyoming to change classes.
The camps were in fact self-sustaining. Incarcerees cleared the land and grew their own food. Women's groups formed, and athletic teams competed. Children found new friends. They created their own beauty.
My mother picked up shells at Dewey Lake and made all those shell corsages. And she learned how to embroider in camp too.
We tried to create things that were worthwhile and take our time away from the war, but it was to our own ability, to our own sweat, that we tried to make it into a livable community.
We were a cast of thousands on the stage of confinement, expressing the full range of our considerable lives: sorrow, fear, anger, joy.
Gama. It means patience, fortitude, and the ability to stand for something.
Perseverance, I think.
Life went on. Holidays came and went. There were births and deaths, and opportunities were seized beyond the wire.
My parents came with me up to the main gate. My mom cried.
During the war, more than 5,000 young men and women would be allowed to leave for colleges outside the exclusion zone.
And I was lucky in being accepted at Ohio West End. So it was pretty good to be a man on campus.
The Americanism of the great majority of America's Japanese finds its highest expression in the thousands who were in the United States Army.
After Pearl Harbor, many of the Nisei already serving were discharged or given menial jobs. But for a short time, some local draft boards continued to induct them.
After the Pearl Harbor, within a month, we went to the board, and my neighbor, Bo, and I said, let's join up. We were the first draftee of 42.
After basic training, the late Shig Imai was eventually assigned to prisoner of war processing units stateside and Hawaii.
There was people that specialized in taking fingerprints and photographs. Knowing the Japanese language, we were asked to be the record keeper. There was a very few Japanese American in Hood River that didn't serve. I just wanted to do my part.
Nisei with additional language training served with the Critical Military Intelligence Service, translating Japanese documents and interrogating prisoners.
Their value was that they were a secret.
They are actually credited for shortening the war in the Pacific because of their translation skills.
In the spring of 1943, President Roosevelt announced the formation of an all-Nisei combat team, the 442nd. The military planned to recruit volunteers from the camps, but to determine their loyalty, the Army and the WRA began administering a poorly worded questionnaire. 2 questions caused the most conflict and anger.
Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered?
Well, if we volunteer, what if this is a ploy and they're going to use all of the Japanese Americans as a cannon fodder?
Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor?
And when you're an Issei and you have no citizenship in the U.S., the concern came up was by forswearing that allegiance, are we giving up our only citizenship and now becoming a nationless person?
And so there was a lot of confusion, and as a result, there were many who defied the questionnaire, who refused to answer, or who answered no, no.
The No-No Boys, as they were called, were branded disloyal and sent to Tule Lake.
We have families that split up in 1943 because what happens when you have that 20-something-year-old male in the family who says no to the questionnaire and everyone else answers yes?
In 1943, the camp was converted into a maximum security segregation facility with nearly 19,000 inmates at its peak.
They bring in over a dozen more guard towers, so you wind up with over 28 guard towers in the camp, searchlights every 50 feet along the perimeter. A secondary fence gets built around the main perimeter of the camp.
A separate stockade and jail further isolated the inmates considered troublemakers.
We know at one point there's over 100 men inside the jail, and we know there's over 300 in the stockade.
Tule Lake would become the most repressive, volatile, and controversial of the 10 camps, and the last to close in 1946. Today, the site is a National Historic Landmark. There are few original structures remaining. The jail is one of them. Graffiti survives inside.
There's a poem that's on one of the cells that face to the west that says, "When the golden sun has
sunken beyond the desert horizon, and darkness follows under a dim light casting my lonesome heart, show me the way to go home."
By May 1944, Nisei volunteers in the 442nd had joined forces with the 100th Battalion, comprised mostly of Japanese Americans from Hawaii's National Guard. Together they fought fiercely in Italy and France.
Their motto was go for broke because they felt like they had nothing to lose. They still are to this day the most highly decorated military unit of its size.
The thing is, before the war and before the service days, people always referred to us as a Japs and a Jap boy, and even in our neighborhood where I grew up, some of the people used to refer to me as a little Jap boy, and I never used to like that, but there was nothing more you could do about it. So I figured, well, once I was serving in the service, then I could say that I'm just as American as anybody else. And well, to this day, that's how I feel.
Back in Hood River, the local chapter of the American Legion had seen things differently. In November 1944, its leaders had ordered the names of 16 Nisei soldiers blacked out from the honor roll on the courthouse wall.
The response around the country was immediate. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, Collier's called this Hood River's blunder.
Letters condemning the action poured into local papers, including from soldiers serving with the 442nd. Local minister Sherman Burgoyne was outraged. This action was unchristian, un-American, and undemocratic, he would say, and he challenged Hood River to replace the names.
He then became a victim because other prominent members of the community antagonized him.
In May 1945, the world celebrated victory in Europe. Later that summer, Japan formally surrendered.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always.
World War II was over. Camps had been closing, and Japanese Americans were gradually leaving. But a harsh reality greeted many.
My father came back to the farm, and they had mass meetings in Gresham. Don't let the Japs come back. They couldn't get insurance. They couldn't sell their produce. Their neighbors didn't want them around.
In Portland, a Japanese cemetery had been desecrated.
I remember going to school and my homeroom teacher hating Japanese. I remember my father, who had 3 businesses before the war, transferring twice on public transportation, going to downtown Portland, making mashed potatoes all day long.
And back in Hood River, a series of ads in the local papers were sending a chilling message.
At the camps, the Issei and Nisei received copies of the Hood River Sun, the Hood River News, and looked at these horrible, horrible ads. And they saw neighbors and people they considered friends who had signed statements discouraging them from returning home.
Among the first to return was Bessie Asai's future husband.
I know that someone threw a rock through the window at his home, and they tried to buy his land because he wouldn't sell.
In the beginning, they couldn't even buy seeds and stuff like that for the farm, or food even, so they'd go as far as the Dalles, that's 20 miles away from Hood River. Or some Caucasian neighbor like Mrs. Arlene Moore would buy the groceries and bring it to them.
And Reverend Burgoyne and Mrs. Moore founded the League for Liberty and Justice. They volunteered to meet Issei and Nisei on the train when they returned from camp. They sponsored educational programs at churches and schools to help others learn about, especially the valiance of the Nisei soldiers.
With pressure mounting, the blacked-out names of the soldiers were eventually restored to Hood River's honor roll. But anti-Japanese attitudes persisted, as Army Captain Sheldon Lawrence found out.
This was right after the war, and my dad was in a barbershop in Hood River when George Akiyama walked in. And George was he was a war veteran, of course, and he was in uniform at the time.
What happened next prompted the captain to write a letter to the Oregonian.
The soldier wore 9 decorations on his battle jacket, among them the Bronze Star and the Silver Star. Less than a minute passed when the manager or owner of the shop stepped to the sergeant and said, "Are you a Jap?" The soldier replied, "What do you mean a Jap? I'm an American." Whereupon the barber ordered him to leave, then added, "I should have cut the blank's throat." My dad witnessed that, and of course he was very angered by it.
Must I return to my own community and witness such unjustified prejudices and insults to some of the nation's best fighting men? Men whose courage, devotion to duty, and battle performance has won the respect and thanks of millions of service people?
Sheldon E. Lawrence, Parkdale, Oregon. And as the tale is told, he walked a half a mile in a snowstorm to get to George's house to personally apologize. So,
Taka and Aya's family, the Iwasakis, left the Ontario area and returned to their farm in Hillsborough, carefully tended during the war by a friend.
We got this German neighbor to negotiate and take over the harvesting of the berries and the selling of the berries and look over the farm until we came back.
In Portland, the Matsushimas opened a new store.
My father had to borrow money from people, started with about $500. The American government wouldn't allow us to use the name Teikoku because it meant imperial. That's when he borrowed the name from a friend of his in Japan and called it Anzen, which means safety.
For many Japanese Americans, just finding a place to live would be difficult.
When the war ended, there was a lot of race prejudice still. We went to this one place and said we would like to, rent the apartment. He says, well, I'm sorry, I won't be able to rent to you folks.
Some Japanese Americans moved into former World War II housing projects like Vanport, or left the area altogether.
They went to Denver, they went to Chicago, they went to New York. Plus the fact that when we were incarcerated, the Chinese folks from Southwest Portland moved into the former Japantown. So when we returned to Portland, it was the new Chinatown.
Across the state, racist attitudes would slowly change. In 1949, the Oregon Supreme Court struck down the state's alien land law. And in 1952, the federal McCarran-Walter Act allowed Japanese nationals, the Issei, to apply for U.S. citizenship.
My parents loved America in spite of what they happened to them, and they always wanted to be citizens of this great country. My mother, who didn't speak English, had to take her test in English, studied for 3 months, passed with flying colors. I was here to witness them becoming citizens, and like other Niseis, very, very proud of that day.
My father and my mother both became American citizens when they were able to, because this was their home.
My father decided that he was not going to get his citizenship. I think he was bitter about the war and what the government did to him.
There was no single incidence of spying or espionage in the 120,000 Japanese that were incarcerated. Not one single incident.
Hood River pioneer Masuo Yasui became a U.S. citizen when he was 66 years old, but he never fully recovered from the war and the stigma of camp.
My father died of suicide. He died partly because of his incarceration.
I had no idea that the camp that my mom went to was so different from the fun, cheerful camp that I went to during the summer. My mom didn't want to talk about it. The Japanese American community didn't want to talk about it.
I became pretty angry about the fact that I didn't know more. And I blamed my mother. I blamed my parents.
They simply wanted to get along. If that meant submerging their feelings, submerging their experiences, and simply forgetting the past, I think some of them probably were doing that.
Then we hit the civil rights movement. It was all really about finding your culture and finding your pride and finding your voice. So it's still a journey.
In the early 1970s, the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL, began the long struggle for an official apology from the U.S. government.
It's like, we have to do this. We're going to do this. And it was the people that came together, that worked together, that believed in the story, that believed in the history, that believed it was important.
In response to the growing movement, President Jimmy Carter created a fact-finding commission in 1980. More than 750 witnesses would testify about their experiences during the war. The commission began issuing its findings in late 1982.
In sum, Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity. The broad historical causes that shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership.
This was a congressional commission saying that this was wrong, that they ought to get redress, and that these were the reasons for it. So clearly had a huge impact.
We gather here today to right a grave wrong.
In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. Japanese Americans who'd been incarcerated and still living would each receive $20,000 tax-free.
There are two groups, I think, that would make redress possible for the Japanese American. One was the bravery and the heroism of the Japanese American soldiers.
You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you've won.
And the other was JACL. Without those two, I'm convinced that we would not have gotten redress.
Everybody ought to be acknowledged for it, including, I believe, the draft resistors, the no-no boys. They were all fighting for the same thing, which was justice, which was in a country that has a constitution like ours, to uphold and defend and to protect the Constitution.
I know there's still some people that didn't approve of us getting the $20,000, but you know, that's nothing to what we lost.
The late Minoru Yasui had been a national leader in the redress movement, and over the years, he'd never given up his own fight for justice.
And what Yasui said to me is, I don't know if we're going to win, Peggy, but we're going to give him hell.
In 1983, Yasui had reopened his curfew violation case using newly uncovered evidence.
The researcher for the Commission on Wartime Relocation found DeWitt's original report that said what the basis of the incarceration really was. That it didn't matter how long it took to figure out the loyal from the disloyal, because you couldn't separate the goats from the sheep. DeWitt based his opinion on the Japanese race is an enemy race. So he's basing it on race and racism.
Yasui lived to see his 1943 conviction vacated or nullified by the U.S. Supreme Court.
On a Saturday night in March of 1942, Minoru Yasui left his law office to walk around Portland, Oregon.
And in 2015, President Barack Obama posthumously awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Lori Yasui, receiving on behalf of Minoru Yasui.
The only Oregonian to receive this award. Over the years, communities in Oregon have acknowledged their past and honored the sacrifices of Japanese Americans with events and tributes. What was once Portland's Assembly Center now houses the Expo Center, welcoming visitors through traditional Japanese torii gates. Metal tags replicate those that once hung from people. And at Idlewild Cemetery in Hood River, a monument made possible by many, including the local American Legion, stands on the Veterans Walk of Honor.
We decided let's not just honor those individuals who were blackened from the honor roll, but all the Japanese Americans who served our country. It's a rock of healing.
This has been a long journey, but a glorious one. And we wish to thank all of you, all Americans, for this recognition.
In 2011, the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded to the Nisei soldiers of World War II.
We feel pretty lucky that they did honor us eventually.
Across the country, those who were incarcerated, family and friends, make annual pilgrimages back to the camps, like this one at Minidoka, to remember, heal, and vow never again.
It's American story. It's all of our story.
So much has been lost from this evacuation day. And it is never going to be regained. So I'm hoping that the country would don't do this again. Don't go this way again. That's what I hope.
With new hope, we build new lives. Why complain when it rains? This is what it means to be free.
There's more about Oregon's Japanese Americans on Oregon Experience Online. To learn more, visit opb.org. Leading support for Oregon Experience is provided by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer, and the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Charitable Trust Fund for Lifelong Learning. Major support provided by the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by the Stephen D. and Marilyn C. Kerman Charitable Fund, Kay Kitagawa and Andy Johnson-Laird, John and Nancy Decherd, Russell and Sylvia Yamada, and the contributing members of OPB and viewers like you. Thank you.
All right, so I want to turn it over to Toby to kind of finish up his presentation and open up the Q&A, and hopefully you are all taking copious notes on those 3 points that he asked us to hone in on. And if you want to also turn your attention to the questions that we have on the back of your agenda, we have questions that also tie in with Toby's ask of us, which also makes relevant some of the current day issues that we're dealing with, everything from immigration, ICE, refugees at our southern borders coming over from Ukraine, so on and so forth, reparations, and the like. So I'm going to turn it back over to Toby, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I also wanted to acknowledge we have facilitators here in this main space, and then we also have a facilitator, Shannon, in the Zoom space. However, we noticed many of our elders and survivors and descendants are also in the Zoom space, and so Caitlin has the ability to keep us kind of all in one space together. Because I know, Toby, I don't know if you saw that show, Desano is here, Uncle Show is here, and pretty sure some other folks as well. So if they want to contribute to the conversation, we'd love to have their input, as well as your mom, Mitzi. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Toby.
Thank you. Can you all hear me again? What I'd like to do is just talk maybe about 10-15 minutes, because I want to leave a lot of time for discussion. But I'm going to show some pictures directly from the film and also from my own family to kind of tell what happened to my mom's family. So I'm going to try and share now. Hopefully you can see a picture that was the first image in that film. If somebody could give me a thumbs up or let me know that this is working. Good, thank you. So this is the first picture in the film. These are my grandparents. My grandparents and my 2 eldest uncles, Uncle Tot and Uncle Min. You also saw many clips of my Aunt Bessie. She turned 99 in March, and she's still with us. This was when she was a young woman, and this is when I visited her just last winter. This is a picture from my mom. That's my mom kneeling in the front right corner. On either side of her is my grandfather and one of her brothers, my Uncle Half. And third from the left in the front is my grandma. So, as I said, my grandfather arrived in America in 1904, 1 year after Mr. Yasui. My grandmother arrived in 1911. She was a picture bride. My grandfather picked her from about we don't know how many, 3 to 5 pictures that my great-grandmother sent him. And she arrived in Seattle on a boat with 40 picture brides. They lived in Hood River and they had 8 children. My grandfather delivered 7 of them at home. My mom, he didn't deliver because she was a complication. She got stuck and he had to ride into town with a horse and wagon, 6, 7, 8 miles to get a doctor or nurse. Didn't know if she'd be alive or his wife would be alive when they got home, but thank goodness they were, and Mom is still here. That's my mom in the front center. She's probably about 6 or 7 years old there. And here they are at Multnomah Falls. My mom and her sister Mika are the only 2 of those 8 children who are still alive. That's my Aunt Mika at her 90th birthday 9 years ago, and that's my mom. My Aunt Mika lives in Ontario. So these are my grandparents on their 50th wedding anniversary. Now, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, 2 of my uncles were already in the service. This is my Uncle Half, who enlisted in June of 1941. And this is my Uncle Tot, my eldest uncle, who joined a week before Pearl Harbor. And he was in military intelligence and did island hopping in the Pacific Theater. In subsequent years, 3 more uncles joined. That's my Uncle Min, who married Aunt Bessie, and my Uncle Jean. And at the very tail end, my Uncle Dick, or Uncle Itsuo, joined. Now, the movie glossed over the wording of Executive Order 9066, which I think deserves more attention. It basically authorized the military to select specific areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. I've highlighted that text. Notice it doesn't say anything about race, whether you're a citizen, anything. They decided the entire West Coast, all Japanese Americans would have to leave. But with this general wording, it could have been used for anything. The military could have said, for military necessity, all Methodists must leave Idaho. Or anybody over 6 foot tall has to leave California. It didn't make any distinction about that, but it was only used against Japanese Americans. Does anybody have any idea how long Executive Order 9066 was in effect? 5 years? 10 years? 20 years? How about over 30 years? It wasn't until 1976 that President Ford rescinded Executive Order 9066. That's how long it was in effect. So it could have been used against any of us. As the film said, every family was issued a family number. This was my mom's family number, 16339. And this is a replica of the paper tag that she had to wear as a 4th grade girl when she was sent on the trains to incarceration. And these were the tags they had on their bags. This is a map showing the journey that my mom's family took. They started at that red dot, which is Hood River, and were first transferred to Pinedale, which was a so-called assembly center in Fresno, California. They were there for about 3 months until the more permanent camps were finished. At that point, they were transferred to Tule Lake, just south of the Oregon border, for about a year. And then after that disastrous loyalty questionnaire that the film talked about, they were transferred to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, which is just outside of Cody, Wyoming. And if you ever go to Wyoming, to Cody, absolutely go to the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. It is excellent. They were there about 2 years, and when they were allowed to leave, my mom's family was one of the first families to return to Hood River. This is a census from Tule Lake, and I've drawn a circle around my mom's family. So you can see my grandparents, my aunt, a couple of uncles, my mom, and it shows the block and barrack number and partitions of which barrack they were in. This is a map showing the Tule Lake camp. You can see how many barracks there were, and I'm pointing at the exact barrack, number 15, that my mom's family was incarcerated for a year. At the time, the Tule Lake population was about 8,000 inmates. After my family was moved to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, that's when all the quote-unquote disloyal people were brought to Tule Lake, and the population ballooned to about 19,000. This is a census from Heart Mountain, Wyoming, and you can barely make out my mom's family name there, and there's the family number, 16339, and again, the block and barrack number. Here's a map showing the camp superimposed over present-day farmland, and I've made a little blue dot in the top left corner in block 28, where my family was incarcerated for 2 years. Heart Mountain at the time had over 10,000 inmates, and it was the third largest city in Wyoming at the time. Now, they glossed over it. My Aunt Bessie talked about how the bathrooms had no privacy. This is what the bathrooms look like. How would you like to use these for 3 years? No partition, no privacy, lines waiting to use them. You could rub shoulders and elbows with the person next to you. It was humiliating and dehumanizing. Now, my mom was just a 4th to 6th grade girl when she was incarcerated, and her experience of camp was very different from that of her older siblings and her parents. She was a young girl. She wasn't fully aware of the greater picture of what was going on, and in camp, she had all these kids her age that she could play with. You know, at home, she worked hard in the farm, walked 1.25 miles to school, walked home, worked more on the farm in the orchard. She didn't have play dates. At camp, she had all these kids to play with. So she actually had a pretty good time at camp. It was after coming home that she experienced her trauma. But for her older siblings and her parents, it was dark. It was a very dark time to be in camp. What would become of them? How long would they be there? Would my uncles who were serving in the military be injured or killed? Would they have a home to come home to? This is a picture of my mom and her brother, my Uncle Dick, on the day that they were released from Heart Mountain, and they're getting ready to board the train to go home. You can see how happy my mom is. But as the film noted, most communities were not excited to have Japanese Americans to come home. You may not have heard this term before, japes. That is a combination of the word Japanese and apes. This is the infamous honor roll that the film talked about. This was the listing of all the people who were in the service, and 16 names of Japanese Americans were removed by the American Legion from this board and made national news. Of those 16 names, 2 of those were my uncles. Up and down the West Coast, Japanese Americans were not welcome home. I think this is from California, and I think this was a barber in Kent, Washington. My mom walked 1.25 miles to and from school, and along that walk, she passed a grocery store that had a big no Jap trade sign in the window. Most businesses would not do business with Japanese Americans. She walked to a middle school called the Barrett School. The school does not exist anymore. There's a house here. This is present day. But that kind of shadowy building off to the right is part of the original school. That they did roller skating in there. Mom walked to and from school to this school. About 1/4 mile farther down the road is this church that my mom also walked to. As a 7th, 8th, or 9th grade girl, she would walk to this church on Sunday, and nobody would sit in the pew with her. And at the end of the service, when people were leaving and the minister was greeting everybody, he would turn his face away from my mom. So she suffered serious social isolation, and like many of her generation, she rejected and hated being Japanese American. She wanted to reject her Japanese heritage. Her given name at birth was Mitsuko, but most of her Caucasian teachers and friends would say Mitsuko. So she unilaterally, between 8th and 9th grade, changed her name from Mitsuko to Mitzi. She said, I'm going to be 150% American. I don't want to be this Japanese thing. This sucks. She unilaterally changed her name, didn't tell anybody, didn't even tell her parents. It wasn't until her father saw this report card that he realized what she had done. He didn't say anything. He smiled. He looked at it, smiled, didn't say a word. But my mom changed her name. She named herself in the 9th grade. So here is when the redress movement that took decades finally came to fruition. And the film talked about how Japanese Americans received a formal apology from the government and $20,000. This was only for those people who were still alive. So by this time, many people had died. My mom was just a 4th to 6th grade girl. She turns 90 years old next month. Standing behind Carter, you see Norman Mineta and the late Senator Daniel Inouye. Norman Mineta served under multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat. He's the same age as my mom. He also is incarcerated in Heart Mountain, and he passed away just this last week. We met him at a pilgrimage to Heart Mountain. I believe that was in 2019, just a few years ago. Here's a copy of the letter signed by the president of apology to my mom. It is one of the most prized possessions that she has. Most governments have black marks against them, and most governments never apologize. This is very rare, and this is very precious to us. So now I'd like to talk about parallels between that history and the present day. The commission that wrote the final report on, in the 80s about the wartime incarceration, the report was called Personal Justice Denied. And the reasoning or the justification for the mass incarceration was concluded to be due to, quote, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So, could this happen today? Have we overcome race prejudice? Have we overcome war hysteria? And have we overcome failures of political leadership? Well, I'm sure most of you know that there's been an appalling rise in violence against Asian Americans. I offer a few examples of present-day events for your consideration. When pandemic relief programs were rolled out, they ignored and excluded undocumented immigrants. Up to 74% are considered essential workers. They work, they pay taxes, and many have children who are US citizens. A tenured University of Pennsylvania law professor in an interview stoked fears about, quote, the danger of dominance of the Asian elite, unquote. She stated further, I think the United States is better off with fewer Asians and less Asian immigration. This was just this last year. During New Year's, a veteran news anchor stated she likes dumplings for New Year's. That's what Koreans do, she said. A viewer called in to complain. I kind of take offense to that. I don't think it's appropriate she said that. She's being very Asian. She can keep her Korean to herself. I think if a white person said that, they would get fired. The present reporting on the tragedy in Ukraine and the humanitarian support it has inspired is in stark contrast to the tone of reporting and lack of support for refugees from Central and South America, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Debates about the teaching of so-called critical race theory reveal the gross misunderstanding and the cynical manipulation of discussions about racism and the teaching of US history. So, what can you do? Well, I invite you to learn more about this history. You can visit the sites of former incarceration camps, that many of them have web pages and Facebook pages. You can read books such as The Stubborn Twig by Lauren Kessler, or any of the many books by Professor Linda Tamura, who you saw many times throughout the movie. This Friday the 13th is exactly the 80th anniversary of when all the Hood River Japanese Americans were rounded up to board the train, its so-called Train of Tears. There's going to be an event this Friday. I wish I could be there. I can't. In Hood River, where there's going to be a march from the Riverside Community Church down to the train depot. I have posted a link here. This is my own blog, and I update this page regularly. It has links to recordings of previous talks my mother and I have given, recommended books, video shorts, photographs, video shorts, etc. I will be updating it with a recording of this presentation once that is made available. There's some excellent online free training. It was formerly called Hollaback. It's now called Right to Be Free, or Right to Be. It's at righttobe.org. They offer free training on bystander intervention if you see somebody being harassed, preventing and responding to harassment, conflict de-escalation, and resilience training. I have taken 2 of these trainings. I cannot recommend them highly enough. They are free. If you have money to donate, they are worthy of your support. LinkedIn Education offers some excellent anti-racism training. However, it is very expensive. Be careful. I recommend you go to your public library. Many public libraries have a LinkedIn Learning account that you can use. That's what I did after I found out how much it cost. The Innovation Law Lab is worthy of your support. It is a crowdsourced project of lawyers, translators, coders, activists. They are dedicated to ending the isolation and exploitation of immigrants and refugees, especially at our southern border. I have a friend who volunteered. He went down to the southern border to assist. They are absolutely worthy of your time and financial support. Finally, speak up for what you know to be right. I trust your judgment. I trust the judgment of a child. If you hear something that you think is wrong, if you see something that is wrong, speak up. The number of families in Hood River that were helpful to my mom's family during those post-war years, you could probably count on maybe 1, maybe 2 hands. We will never forget those people. I have cousins named after some of those people. Don't let anybody tell you your voice doesn't matter. It does. It absolutely does. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. I'm grateful. My mom and I are grateful for your attention and your interest. We would be happy to answer any questions you have, whether it's online using the chat feature or in person. I will stay here as long as they keep the lights on, and any questions that we don't get to, I will answer on my blog. Thank you very much.
Can hear me. So while Caitlin queues up the Zoom space, are there any questions, comments, or reactions that folks would like to share based on what they saw and what they've heard so far? We have a microphone. I think, Sylvia, you're going to come and walk the mic around. So if anybody would like to have an opportunity to share. And also, I know, Alicia, you had something you wanted to share as well. And we have a couple of mics up here if folks want to walk around. No reactions? Okay, why don't you come on up?
And no question is taboo or off limits. You can say anything and ask anything. Please.
Awesome. Can you see us? Caitlin, is it possible to add more folks up so we can see the folks in Zoom land, or?
I suppose.
I just wanted to humbly add something from the history department. Actually, the histories of several McMenamins locations include the experiences of Japanese American families who were forced into these concentration camps. The Nakamura family, whose children went to Kennedy Elementary School here, actually donated cherry trees that are here, and you can actually read about more about them in the display cases here that are in the building.
loud as this podium mic gets, but yeah.
Okay, sure.
And slowly.
Sorry, okay, I can start over a bit. So the Nakamura family, whose children went to Kennedy Elementary School, they donated the cherry trees that are here, and you can read about them in the display case here that has some of the history of the building. The Koji family were former managers of the Majestic Hotel, which is now McMenamins Crystal Hotel. The Kanaya family from Bothell, Washington, and James Kitagawa, educator and Anderson School graduate, 1958, are all some of the families that the artists have honored by representing them in some of the artwork, and at the locations you can also find photos of them as well. So I just wanted to add that there's a lot of history in places you might not realize, and it just reminds us that it really wasn't that long ago. So
thank you, Alicia.
I'm not sure if folks in Zoom could hear, there were some issues, but they've asked that if we could speak loudly and speak slowly. So any other questions here? Okay, so Chip, oh, no, who, go ahead and tell us your name, stand up.
Hi there, how's it going?
You got a rock star it.
Okay, all right.
I don't think the mic is on.
Hello. Hi there. How's it going? My name is Robert King. My full name is Robert Masato Taketake. So my grandfather actually spent time in Key Lake. He was the youngest of 8. His parents both came from Hiroshima, met in the fields of Florida, California, as farm laborers, and they started a drag goods store, after having 8 kids, and they kind of ran out of names, so they named my grandfather Junior. They gave them all American names, but they all have Japanese names, so his name is Takumi, and he goes by Tak, because after the war, he couldn't go by Takumi. I was talking to my friend Josh right here the other day about kind of my oral history, and I kind of documented it from feudal Japan in the 1500s all the way until modern day. And he had a lot of questions, but I reminded him, my family story, them serving in the 442nd, dying in Italy for this country, going to camps. Everybody joined the military. My grandfather, he was 8 when he was in camps, and he retired eventually as a colonel. He joined the military after the war, but it doesn't really matter. Well, my story matters, and my family story matters a lot, but every single story is just like that, just like Toby's and Mitzi's. It's kind of crazy how similar it was. And I have my Caucasian side's also from Oregon, so. And after the war too, he wanted to assimilate, and so he didn't teach any of my mother or her sisters Japanese, and now I don't speak Japanese. It's interesting, but luckily my grandmother, Gladys Yamada, her and her friends, it was mostly her friends, Irene Katsumoto, and a bunch of other people in the Bay Area. This is in El Cerrito, where they all settled because they were redlined out of Oakland. They couldn't buy property, but they were sitting around in a kitchen, probably smoking cigarettes because it's the 70s, watching their kids play, and they're like, dang, our kids don't know anything about their culture and where they come from. And so they actually started a cultural summer school, a camp, if you will, called Daruma no Gakko, DARUMANO GAKKO. That that's still going today in the Bay Area. And so basically what they do is teach us about Japanese American history and also our culture, not only Japanese culture, but Japanese American culture. And it's still going today, even with Zoom and everything and that hybrid era. But I kind of wanted to just share a little bit from me. I wasn't really expecting to come up here and talk. I actually was invited by my neighbor, Rie, my next door neighbor. And so I kind of went into this blind, but I just wanted to, thank you for sharing your story. And I learned a lot more than I thought I was going to, especially Ontario, Oregon. It was fascinating. I just wanted to thank you.
Unfortunately, I can hear Toby loud and clear, but I cannot hear the host or the question from the audience. It is too soft and muffled.
He was mostly sharing his own family history. If there are questions, I will repeat them to you, Mom.
Okay.
I want to thank you for sharing your history. And when I give these talks, the other takeaway I try to impress on people is to interview your parents, your grandparents, aunts, and uncles. My grandparents died right before and after I was born. Grandma died a year before I was born, and Grandpa died a year after I was born. And I only know these stories because Mom collected them and wrote them down and has been sharing them. Mom, want to hold up your book so people can see it? And it's easy. So this is Mom's book. You can't find it online or in bookstores. Buy it directly from her or from me. She'll be happy to sign a copy. You can contact through my website. I can get you in touch and get you a copy. I think $15 covers the book and shipping. But it's so easy today with your cell phone, with your smartphone, to sit down and ask your parents, your grandparents, what was it like growing up? And they may put you off and say, it's not that interesting. No, be persistent. You'll be so grateful to have those stories, and even more importantly, recordings of your ancestors after they've passed. I did see a question in the chat from Arlene. She asked, did your family talk freely about their incarceration experience, or were they reticent? I am grateful because my mom is a very unusual person in that she has been talking about this for as long as I can remember. Most people who experienced this did not talk about it. As you heard in the documentary, Kitagawa, it can't be helped. There's no good talking about bringing up those bad memories. It's past. Many people never learned about this history, maybe even until after their parents or grandparents had died. They didn't even know. Marlene also commented that she was amazed to find out that Karen Korematsu, the daughter of Fred Korematsu, who also went to the Supreme Court and lost his case, she didn't know this story until she heard about it in her own high school class. There's a great podcast about that story, and I think I have that linked from my website. Thanks.
Chip, you had a question? Toby, can you hear me? If I speak Mitzi, can you hear me from this mic?
I can't hear you.
You cannot hear me.
Toby, you're muted.
I can hear you, Shayna, and I can repeat it to Mom.
This is a personal. Mitzi, can you hear me?
No, she won't be.
Okay. Well,
I can.
Okay. This is a personal statement that I want to make. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, and Mr. Loftus was one teacher. So I would go to piano lessons at the Loftus house. So you weren't born yet. I knew your brother David, and I can't remember your other brothers, but they were little kids. And now at 68, I'm sure they're in their 60s because I was only about 8 or 9 years old going to piano lessons. And one of the things on my journey And also, my dad, Fred Masseri, gave me Mitzi's book, and I read it, and it's very, very well written. And I think back, on my journey as a white person, in my journey of kind of understanding things that I didn't understand when I was growing up. I think about, kind of how did I look at Mitzi different? I would say Mrs. Loftus, because I never called her Mitzi, I called her Mrs. Loftus. That Mrs. Loftus, looked different than Mr. Loftus, and I, wonder what was going on in my 8 or 9-year-old brain. But of course, this is just one of many little bits that I received as a white person growing up in America about differences in people that look differently than I did. But anyway, I just wanted to, after I read the book, I got online, I Googled Mitzi Loftus. I tried to get a hold of her and tell her how much I enjoyed reading the book and just to reconnect. And I'm glad, at least through Toby, your interpretation or your echoing my words, just to thank your mom for sharing her story. And I just wanted to say hi to your family.
Toby, I muted you while you were typing.
What was her question?
He remembers being a student of Don's when he was 8 or 9 years old in Eugene, and he just wanted to talk about wondering what he thought as a little boy and growing up as a white man, thinking about, oh, they looked very different, and how much he enjoyed your book.
Oh, well, while I was in the kitchen listening to the piano lesson when he was in our house taking the lessons.
This is just an interesting thing. So the Loftus family was very resourceful, and also had a tropical fish store in the front part of their house. So I walked through tropical fish store to get to my piano lesson. That was also a fun memory.
Thank you, Chip. Are there any other questions or comments or reactions? Go ahead.
I am so impressed or amazed by the deep resiliency of the people that were in those internment camps. And I wonder how they didn't get angry and resentful and give up on America and go back to Japan. I'm amazed by all that.
Yeah, this is a common question. The question is, they're so amazed by the resilience and determination of Japanese Americans. How come people didn't get angry and disgusted and maybe go back to Japan? Most people who experienced this experience, being incarcerated, that I've met, are very angry and very bitter. Many still can't talk about it. And my mom is unusual in that she's been open about it. And I would say, with all due respect to my mom, like I said, she was a little girl, so her experience of camp was very different. And since I'm the youngest of 3, I'm the baby, and she's the baby, a youngest of 8, I think there's a privilege that comes with being the baby. But most people are very bitter who experienced that. They may not have given up on America, although there are some people who did leave America. One thing that was not covered in the film was the Renunciation Act. So if we think back to Tule Lake, when there were 18,000 very unhappy people who had answered no to one or both of those loyalty questions, it was a hotbed of uprisings and protests and torture and all. It was terrible. Well, the government wanted to deport these people, but you can't deport a U.S. citizen. So they passed the Renunciation Act, which allowed you to renounce your citizenship. Now, if you renounce your citizenship, what citizenship do you have? None. But why would somebody renounce their citizenship? Well, you know, the war is going on an awful long time. I wonder if Japan's winning. Well, gee, mom and dad can't become citizens. My grandparents could not become naturalized until 1952. They had been in the United States for 30 years before World War II. They could not become naturalized because racist laws prevented naturalization. Gee, mom and dad are aliens. They're probably going to be deported. Let's renounce our American citizenship and keep the family together. Over 5,000 people renounced their citizenship. And it took one lone ACLU lawyer 10, 15 years to combat and restore their citizenship.
I put in the chat, you used the word internment, and so we received feedback from Jeff Selby. I put it in the.
Can you get a little closer?
Oh, sorry, can you hear me okay? I'm still working with the technology, y'all. So Jeff Selby is with the City of Portland, Office of Equity and Human Rights, and he is Japanese American and son of a Japanese immigrant and a combat veteran. He served 2 terms in the Army, I believe. I cut that part off, y'all, put it back into the chat. But what he wrote and shared with me to share with you all is the term internment does not accurately describe the incarceration of Japanese Americans during the war. Internment is a legal definition that refers to the confinement of enemy aliens in a time of war, but since most of the Nikai were American citizens, the term does not apply. Instead, the terms incarceration camp or American concentration camp are recommended. A concentration camp is a place where people are imprisoned not because of any crimes they committed, but simply because of who they are. And these are just a few examples of how the Nikai community is calling out deliberate, deceptive terms, and it's happening all the time. We saw the Trump administration refer to the cells and cages where Mexican babies and toddlers were imprisoned after being forcibly separated from their parents as tender age shelters. And Orwell's vision of 1984's Newspeak is alive and well. It's up to all of us to call it out. So if you're wondering why it's crossed out on our poster language, Jeff called me and said, you know, Shane, we don't use that word internment. I said, no problem. We got red markers. We'll cut it out. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. If anybody, I mean, internment camp is still the most common term used, but I challenge anybody to describe what an internment camp is or what internment is, or if they've ever heard it used for anything other than the camps into which Japanese Americans were forced. Most people can't tell you what internment is. I mean, there is a legal definition. I have written an article or blog post about euphemisms. It's not my own ideas. These are ideas other people have come up with. But I reject the term internment as well. Incarceration camps or concentration camps, although I understand that is awkward and controversial. But thank you, Jeff, for bringing that up.
I know we are about at our time. I'd love to open the mic to Mitzi for any final words or thoughts that she would like to leave us with before we close this portion of our program.
Mom, do you have any closing or any statements or invitations that you would like to give to our listeners?
Well, there was a lot of material covered in that film, and it brought back over 80 years of memories of those things that I remember you actually experiencing them, and thinking back to how happy and proud I was to have known the Yasui family. I used to go into the Yasui store with my father, and while my father and he chattered away, I stared at a bowl of candy that sat up on the glass display things. And then Mr. Yasui will look away and see my face, and he's, sorry, and he'd reach in and get a piece of candy and hand it to me. That's the last memory I have of Mr. Yasui, and I was probably 7 or 8 years old. And also remember many other people that were in that film. And since I had such a happy experience during the camp, people don't know about the sad part of my life, which led me to change my name from Mitsuko to Mitzi. And I'm very happy that I forced my 3 sons to go with me on a pilgrimage to the Tule Lake Relocation Center. I went there 3 times, but once I told my sons they must go with me. And I think that was a very important thing. And my nephew, as a matter of fact, and his wife and son also went with us. And then I had forced my sons to do that, but in return, Toby forced me to do a pilgrimage to Heart Mountain Relocation Center. And that it was certainly very, very important, because I didn't realize that the camp was a mile square. And so I'm thinking, I never knew or saw many of the people who were in that camp who were at the other end of the camp, because I had no occasion to be walking mile or mile and a half or 2 miles to the other border of the camp. And so I thank Toby, and I also want to tell you that Toby has my family name, Asai, as his middle name. And that came about because we chickened out giving a Japanese middle name to my first 2 sons, because I was afraid of the prejudice I experienced they might have to experience with that. But I'm so sorry that we didn't give them middle names, because Toby is so proud of his middle name, my family name, Asai, that he used on his high school papers. He used to write at the heading of, assignment, you put your name and then the class and the date, whatever. And he'd always proudly put Toby Asai Loftus, with the Asai written in Japanese characters that I taught him how to write. So I guess we should have been braver and given the other boys middle names. Maybe they would be proud of it too. And it's an interesting thing, the fact that we were known as the Asais, maybe not because of discrimination, but because I just didn't pronounce her family correctly, so family name. So if anybody asks you about my family who are over 90 years old, they'll say, Asai, I don't know any Asai. Oh, you mean the Asais? Well, when my brother Min's granddaughter became a lawyer, and I didn't know her because she grew up after I left Hood River to go to the university. And so I thought, she became a lawyer, and I thought, I think I'll stop by the office and see what her place is like. And I went in and said to the desk clerk, has Jessica Asai arrived yet? And she gave me this very stern look and said, you mean Asai? And I said, yes, that one. So now the 3rd and 4th generation folks are very proud of their Japanese heritage, something that I had to really work on, because I suffered from reverse prejudice because of my experience of being discriminated from the 7th grade through pretty much through high school, and some remnants of discrimination even to my senior year at the University of Oregon. So we've made some progress.
What did she study at the university? What did you study, Mrs. Loftus?
I majored in English and psychology with a degree in education, because I intended to be a teacher, and I taught in high schools for over 30 years.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I also studied French, and I did teach French part-time in Eugene.
Anything else that you taught?
She taught English for non-native speakers for many years at Southwestern Oregon Community College.
And of course, I taught English to Japanese middle school students in Japan for a year on the Fulbright program. And I was a total foreigner in Japan. No, I never passed for Japanese. I tried hard, but my body language and my facial expression, everything just gave me away. Besides, I talked too much. So I had to be American.
Thank goodness for that.
Well, we have a program about critical race theory, so Toby, ask your mom to come on back and take part in that conversation. It's an ongoing conversation we've been having. We'd love to have her. This concludes the official movie portion of the program. Normally what we do is we have facilitators at each table, and they help to facilitate meet and greet, and then we do a business card exchange. So we're going to shift it up a little bit because I know you're generally sitting at a table with somebody that you already know. So I'm going to ask if our participants here will stand up, stretch your body, and go walk towards somebody that you don't know. Feel free to put your mask on, observe 6 feet. And what I'd like you to do, you're not leaving, okay, but you're walking over and you're going to introduce yourself to somebody you don't know. And then you are going to get a business card that's in your packet, and you're going to swap a name and number. You're going to put your name and number on one card, give it to that person. They're going to give their name and number to you, and then you're going to put on a third piece of paper both of your names to be entered into this drawing, so you can win a $25 McMenamins gift card and come back here on us and get to know somebody new in community. So that's something we do here, and we've been doing here for the past 12 years. Now, I know y'all ain't leaving. Okay, I got my eye on you. Now, make sure when you stand up, I'm going to give you all about 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes. We can get up and stand up in 5 minutes. Go find somebody you don't know. If you want a passport stamp on the welcome greeter table, we have a participant sign up. Go ahead and put your name and information on there before you leave, and we'll follow up with you about how to get that passport.
Really quick, okay.
So Toby, would you please announce your contact information for those who aren't able to see the chat?
Yes, the easiest way to reach me is via my website at tobyloftus.com, TOBYLOFTUS.com. There's a contact me link on there. You can contact me if you're interested in getting a copy of Mom's book. You will find a link there to my list of resources, of recordings of previous talks, and more resources. Ask me anything.
Thank you. If there's anyone else in the Zoom who would like to share your contact information, you can type it out. I think we might still be broadcast at McMenamins. Are we still, Caitlin?
The photo that was used in the publicity for this particular event is a picture of me and my brothers and my mother. And in my book, you'll see many pictures that were either in our film you saw, as well as the photos that Toby put in his while he was talking.
And if you go to my list of links, you'll see several talks that my mom has given and that I've given that go into a lot more in depth about our specific family experience.
Thank you so much. Let's see if, looks like Shayna has muted. Caitlin and Shayna have muted. So we ask for folks to fill out the evaluation, and it will enter you into a drawing for the $25 Third Eye Bookstore gift card. That is the last or the only remaining Black-owned bookstore with brick and mortar bookstore in Oregon. It's right here in Southeast Oregon, and you need to visit if you haven't. It's I feel like my life changed just talking with Miss Williams, the co-owner, with her husband. So anyway, the evaluation helps us because we pay very close attention to what you have to say about the program or your thoughts about how you'd like it to change or what you liked about it or how we could improve. So that is linked in the chat a couple of times. And they also, well, we used to do them all in person, so I don't know what they're doing over there at Kennedy School. So is there any further thoughts or questions before we go?
No, but I just wanted to thank all of you for coming. This is Donna Maxey, who's the founder of Race Talks, and it was very moving. And unfortunately, it's a story that we hear too many times across too many cultures. So thank you for sharing, and thank you for helping to make this a better world. Good night.
Thank you so much. We're grateful for your interest, and I will tell the story and share with anybody who wants.
Yeah, so I'd like to say thank you very much. I have lots of things. I'm a little shy on digesting, so yeah, just thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Jiro-san. Please reach out to me through my website. I'll be happy to talk with you, and if you want to get Mom's book, we can get you connected.
I will.
Thank you so much. I know that there are people listening who did not know any of this, and you've just enlightened a whole bunch of other viewers and listeners. Sometimes we look at the numbers and we go, these aren't the hundreds that used to be in our events, and then we check back later and we notice that hundreds have watched the recordings later, and we will make sure that the link is posted on our Facebook and things like that so people can go and find that film if they didn't get to watch it. So but thank you so much for your generosity, sharing your stories, being so open to the public, talking with you. Thank you so much.
It's our privilege. Thank you to you all for making space for this, and I will keep saying it over and over again. Anybody who has questions, wants to talk, learn more, reach out to me.
Consider that there were 120,000 of us who were incarcerated, and I'm going to be 90 years old. My sister's 99. That the first-hand accounts are going to be gone completely very soon. And so we're happy that we had this opportunity. I've been talking for 50, 60 years, but still people have not heard the story.
Thank you so much for sharing it with us, sharing your life. And it was really great to have you here tonight. So with that, unless there's any further questions or comments, they've closed on out in person, and we can do the same here whenever you're ready to go. Is there anyone else who has comments or questions before we close it out? We're good. I think we're good to go for the evening. So thanks again, and I hope you have a really good night, and thank you so much for your gift tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Bye, folks. Hey, Caitlin, are we all, is our stream ended? Because we're done. Caitlin? Caitlin?
Hi, Shannon. Just give me 1 second. I won't be able to hear you for just 2 seconds. That one. Okay. Hold on, let me put my headphones in. Thank you for closing it. Oh, geez. Thank you for closing it out on the Zoom end. I appreciate that.
I don't know how, I think you're the one with the power to end the, did you already end the live stream earlier?
We are still on Facebook.
What's that?
I said I did not. We are still on Facebook. We were still on Facebook. I appreciate the reminder.